Hello, my name is Ken Reinhard, and on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's book talk featuring my friend Maeera Shreiber and her recent work, Holy Envy, Writing in the Jewish Christian Borderzone, which was published by Fordham University Press in fall of 2022. This event today is possible with support from the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn program. And we'd like to thank you for staying socially distant and remaining intellectually engaged with us by joining for these virtual events. So I'm going to briefly introduce Maeera now, and then she's going to make some comments, and then we're going to have a discussion about her book. So Maeera Shreiber is a professor of English at the University of Utah, and she formerly was director of religious studies there. She is the author of Singing in a Strange Land, Jewish American Poetry and Poetics, which came out on Stanford University Press in 2007, as well as numerous articles in journals such as the AJS Review, Prooftexts, and the PMLA on topics including poetry, religion, and Jewish thought. And of course, she is the author of the book we are discussing today, Holy Envy. She has held many fellowships, including those from the Stanford Humanities Center, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Frankel Institute for Advanced Jewish Studies. Recently, she was a Senior Fulbright Scholar at Haifa University. So I'm going to turn this over to Maeera now, and she's going to give us something of a presentation about the book, and then we will have a discussion.
So thank you, Ken, and thanks also to all of you at UCLA's Leve Center for Jewish Studies. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you about my new book, and thanks to all of you for listening into this discussion. I'm going to start with the book behind the book that started it all. So the book that started it all, the Jewish Annotated New Testament. For most of my career, I've been thoroughly immersed in the world of Jewish letters, largely interested in ways of thickening our understanding of the cultural function of Jewish American poetry. To be sure, I knew about the Eucharist. After all, I regularly taught such powerful poets like Gerard Manley Hopkins and John Donne, for whom Christianity is essential. But other than that, I knew little. Frankly, I cared little about what living in America we call the dominant religion. All of that changed 8 years ago when I attended the annual conference of the American Association of Religious Studies. Reading through the program, I noticed that an old friend from college, Mark Brettler, was speaking. I didn't pay much attention to what he was talking about, but I knew that since he had a stellar reputation as a Hebrew Bible scholar, it was bound to be interesting. However, nothing prepared me for the swell of intellectual energy filling the packed room, generated by an August gathering of Jewish and Christian scholars debating the then newly published Jewish Annotated New Testament, which Mark had co-edited. I took a deep breath, I looked around, and I wondered, what interest could the New Testament possibly hold for a Jewish studies scholars? And yet at that point, I was one of them, a relatively literate, actively identified Jew whose knowledge of the New Testament didn't extend much beyond the first verse of the Gospel of John, for the idea of the originary word, logos, is a staple in literary studies. After the session, I went straight to the book exhibit and bought a copy of J.Ant, Jewish Annotated New Testament, and it was there that I first encountered the term holy envy, the first step in an intellectual journey that resulted in this book. Yes, and there's the cover. So I started to read J.Ant, and I just was caught immediately by the phrase that was new to me, holy envy. as offered by the Swedish theologian Christer Stendahl as one of his 3 rules requisite for religious understanding. Stendahl never explained the term fully, other than enjoining his congregants to leave room for holy envy. As a result, numerous efforts have been made to flesh out this evocative locution, and here I want to offer mine. Holy envy. This is what is missing from most interfaith encounters. Calling for a more active, demanding, effective condition than the dispassionate tolerance that typically presides over such meetings, Stendahl challenges us to be genuinely vulnerable and to recognize that there may be something about another faith that is genuinely lacking in one's own, and thus to risk experiencing in all its pain and discomfort the shameful condition we call envy. With this term, as I understand it, Stendahl means us to understand that real interfaith encounters require more than mutual tolerance. Rather, such meetings demand that one be not merely open to recognizing what is admirable about a faith tradition other than one's own, but also open to actively recognizing that a different tradition has features absent from one's own faith, thus acknowledging a genuine lack and recognizing an object of envy. Such cross-religious forays can be more challenging, more painful, and finally, more risky. Like many intellectual projects, this one is also rooted in a personal narrative. And at this moment, I want to talk a little bit about how I think about the word border zone, which is in my subtitle. Now, the idea of borders has long been a part of academic conversation, and some of you may well think of Gloria Ansel-Dua's seminal book about borderlands. And that helped me come to my own ideas about the border zone. A little background. Jews have long had a complicated history when it comes to borders and boundaries. Early in the Hebrew Bible, the Israelites are known by others as Ivrim. Hebrew is in the anglicized version. That is, the crosser-overs who traversed the Euphrates River. Interestingly enough, this term appears only when the Ivrim interact with non-Ivrim. In other words, there is something distinctive, different about being a border crosser, something that sets this group apart from others. Despite this designation, or perhaps because of it, Jews are people obsessed with setting firm boundaries, dietary boundaries, temporal boundaries, and interpersonal boundaries, particularly when it comes to relationships with non-Jewish others. For all of our well-intended rhetoric about welcoming the stranger, an injunction based on our own long sojourns in foreign lands, we too have struggled for much of our history with the fear of the other. Indeed, we should note that the word Ivrim shares the same Hebrew root, ayin vet resh, as averah, meaning transgression, a violation of a sacred boundary. Many of the more serious and injurious averot transgressions are occasioned by Jewish, non-Jewish interactions. For many years, my own Judaism was grounded in this particular linguistic variation, crossing as transgression, a stain to be studiously avoided. From my mid-teens well into my 30s, I lived as an Orthodox Jew. My world was defined by boundaries. I strictly observed the laws of Shabbat, including those dictating that on Shabbat one can carry objects only within an area demarcated by an eruv, a boundaried space determined according to Jewish law. But long before I took upon myself to observe those strictures, I knew that there were certain boundaries that were inviolate, specifically boundaries between Jews and non-Jews. I didn't grow up in an Orthodox family. My father was an ardent secular Zionist who sent me to an Orthodox day school so that I could learn Hebrew. But he insisted firmly that I not try and foist all that Narishkeit nonsense on him. My mother, in particular, who grew up as one of only 5 Jewish families in Shawnee, Oklahoma, was very social and had many non-Jewish friends. Nonetheless, I grew up with a clear sense of difference, us and them, Jews and Goyim. Here's just one memory. I was in my late 20s and I was standing at my grandmother's graveside as she was about to be buried. As is customary, family and friends lined up to help shovel dirt over the casket, a sign of love and deep respect. A non-Jewish friend took up the shovel. My father grabbed the shovel out of the friend's hand and shoved him aside. For as he understood it, Jews should only be buried by other Jews. I want to stress here that my father had exquisite manners and was a secular Jew. But his own schooling in the primacy of non-Jewish Jewish boundaries was so deeply ingrained that it overrode all other courtesies and considerations. I've thought about this moment many times over the years, and am only now beginning to understand the consequences of being schooled in a worldview that insisted upon inviolate religious boundaries, a perspective informed by an acute ambivalence, even a hostility towards the non-Jewish other. I think that Ken and I are going to talk a bit more about the specific writers and issues I explore. But before we begin our conversation, I want to say something about the cover image, since it really dramatizes how, in the course of writing the book, I began to make connections between Judaism and Christianity differently. The piece, and you can see it there on the cover, is called Reliquary 2. It's part of a series by the artist Beth Krensky. Prior to writing this book, I don't think I would have known what to make of this object, which was assembled to honor a decaying shul in New Haven. It's a simple bronze box with just a hint of gold trim surrounding an opening containing a talit, a prayer shawl, Jewish prayer shawl. I might have felt slightly discomforted. I might have looked away. I might have dismissed it as an ill-conceived travesty, or at least a barbed provocation. For the word reliquary brings to mind slow meandering walks through shadowy cathedrals, peering at constructions containing bones, hair, or bits of fabric belonging to a saint or holy figure. All of this seemed alien to my account of holiness, which has little to do with revering bodies or even objects other than books or scrolls containing one of the Hebrew names of God. But after having spent so much time in the Jewish Christian Borderzone, I was open to seeing Krensky's piece differently. A reliquary containing a clearly recognizable Jewish prayer garment and crafted to honor a once thriving Jewish place of worship. This demanded my attention. Knowing little about reliquaries, I learned that rather than fetishizing the dead, as I had ignorantly thought, reliquaries are believed to have a restorative, transformative function, for they began as a response to the traumas suffered by early Christian martyrs, whose bodies were often subjected to such acts of desecration as burning and dismemberment. By enshrining the remains, reliquaries sought to compensate for the trauma by providing a sacred space whereby holiness and wholeness could be restored and access to the divine can be achieved. Including enclosing that which is of the divine, reliquaries conceal as much as they reveal, making vivid the intimate and ultimately mysterious nature of the divine encounter. Turning back to Krensky's Reliquary 2, I stopped clenching my jaw and I began to see. The bronze case is small. The window is covered with mica, a prayer-thin material to which Krensky is drawn, both because it is translucent, but also because of its metaphysical resonances. Mica is believed to help one see the self as well as others more clearly and without judgment. Indeed, so much of this book and my own intellectual, psychological, and indeed spiritual process has been about learning to see the religious other as dispassionately and fully as possible, even when the writers I consider are caught up in dense webs of difficult emotions. Unlike traditional reliquaries, which are often thickly covered in gold, Prensky takes a lighter approach. There's just a little bit of gold leaf. In this way, she casts her reliquary in dialogue with Catholic tradition rather than simply appropriating it. So what of the talit, the prayer shawl contained within? Unlike objects typically housed within a traditional reliquary, the talit does not signify the presence of a specific holy person. Rather, it is linked to prayer. It's an act of sacred encounter with the divine other. And the blessing that is typically said upon wearing this garment is worked into the top of the piece. Typically, most Jews, men and increasingly women, wear a talit while praying. Hurrying either to join or start the service, many, myself included, often say the prayer very quickly under our breaths while wrapping the talit around our shoulders, focusing on what lies ahead. We take little time to consider how the act of enwrapping symbolically enacts a moment of holy reparation, a way of setting to right one's relationship with the divine other. Indeed, prior to this inquiry, I knew little about the weighting meaning of the talit. That is, until I saw it as part of a reliquary, an enclosure meant to serve as the site of sacred restoration. And then I felt compelled to learn more about the ritual garment that I have worn regularly for more than 20 years. So it seems right to start with this image, Reliquary 2, a Borderzone artifact which dwells in the space in between Jewishness and Christianity, a space alive with new meanings. And into this space, I welcome our conversation.
Well, thank you, Maeera. That was a fascinating introduction. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you more about all this interesting material. One of the things that first occurs to me as you're talking about the cover image of that reliquary with the tallis in it is that it's not simply about ideas and concepts that that we're talking about. It's not about the intersection of Judaism and Christianity just as religious beliefs and theories even, but it's also about feelings or affect.
Very much so.
Yeah. Can you say something more about how these things, these really, if you will, concepts and feelings work for some of these writers? Do you sense that there's a conflict between their ideas about Jewish Christian relations and their feelings, or do they seem to correspond? We haven't even talked about the various poets that you just, so maybe you should, quickly mention them too, so that people are aware.
Sure. So I'll start with your last question and then we'll move into your first question. So, or at least the last comment is really just naming some of the poets that I consider. So most of the poets are 20th century. There are poets including Gertrude Stein, Louis Zukofsky, who was an avant-garde poet who wrote primarily in the 20s, 30s, and well into the 50s. Carl Shapiro, who was a fascinating poet, was very, very popular when he was writing, especially in the 40s and 50s, and kind of has fallen out of favor, but he's historically and culturally a very interesting figure. And then there's the poet Denise Levertov, who some of you may think, well, is she a Jewish poet? And that's a question indeed that is very central, because I have not thought of her as a Jewish poet. And that was one of the things that led me to really think about the ways in which she fits and doesn't fit in to those religious divisions.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And what about the way that for these poets, their ideas and their feelings about this kind of border zone, as you talk about it, between Judaism and Christianity, how does that work? Is there a conflict for them, or do they seem to have, their feelings follow their ideas, or how does that work?
I think that my sense is the feelings start first. And the feelings are the things that inform, they are the undercurrents, they're the bubbling, churning, sometimes inchoate mass of emotions that give rise to the poetry. I think, for example, of someone most painfully, let's say, is someone like Carl Shapiro, who did not much think of himself as a Jewish poet. He was not a religious person by any means. He was very secular and assimilated, and yet found himself obliged to claim a Jewish identity in an interesting moment when Ezra Pound was awarded the Bollingen Prize, which is a very famous and important poetry prize. And Shapiro was on that committee and warred with himself about what to do in the face of someone who's granted a brilliant poet, but also a nefarious anti-Semite. And Shapiro voted against him. And it was a decision that haunted him, that grieved him, and sent him into a tailspin, excavating his own dark feelings towards Christianity. And for me, he's really the one who embodies most this poetics of envy. And I'll say that there's not much holy about the poems. They're pretty mean-spirited. Many of them are just awful, but they're worth looking at because they do name feelings of anxiety and feelings of being marginalized and resentment towards the construction of Judeo-Christianity, which was very central to his own period of coming into maturity as a poet. And I think that these feelings are important to make visible, in that they're there and they continue, I think, at different times we bump up against them, especially when we're in interfaith dialogue occasions. And my hope is that some of the conversations that I invite with this book would facilitate more moments of recognition and allow a kind of more deeply transparent interfaith conversation.
Thank you for that response. That's really interesting. Just a further question about that whole situation with the Bollingen Prize. Now, is your sense that for Shapiro, there was real question about Pound's, let's say, poetic merit, that it wasn't simply a question of Pound the anti-Semite? I mean, it's interesting that it was William Carlos Williams Patterson that was the sort of the other favorite. And honestly, for me, it's hard to say which is the greater poem. Although I would probably side with Pound, even though, as a human being, of course, he was pretty ugly. Is that Shapiro's approach, or did he really have problems with Pound as a poet?
It's a really great question, because Shapiro was a formalist, and he really believed in the sturdy containers of rhyme and regular meter and stanzaic forms. And I think that there might have also been absolutely some more than ambivalence, but deep sense of being threatened by someone who was a magnificent poet and not writing with regard to the dictates of formal verse. So I think you're right to bring that up.
Right. Although, of course, Williams wasn't exactly a traditional formalist
Right.
either. But nevertheless, Pound seemed to be the figure who is most directly addressing the kind of avant-garde,
Absolutely.
anti-formalist sort of,
Right. Right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. Fascinating.
And Williams had Jewish lineage.
Ah, I didn't know
So,
that. How interesting.
yeah, his mother um,
Oh,
had
that's pretty.
was not Jewish, but had Jewish lineage.
I
So there
see.
was perhaps a little bit of well, if we have to pick between one of them,
Yeah.
we'll pick the Jewish one.
Very interesting. Um, I wanted to go back to this idea that you get from Christer Stendhal of holy envy. Um, it's such a fascinating concept, and it
It is.
seems as if for him and for you, it's not simply as in Sian Nai's expression, which you refer to, an ugly feeling, right? It's not simply a kind of a sense of desire for something or resentment against something, but it also seems to include, something more like a powerful mode of relationship, right? Something that
Yeah.
implies not only what the other has that I don't have, but really my own lack, that there's something in me that could actually, if you will, benefit from that other person, that other thought, if you will. So, how does
Right.
that work as a mode of relationship? Is envy a possible kind of vehicle for a real relationship?
It's an excellent question. I think it can be, if envy can be the strategy, if one can and has the emotional capacity to sit with the dark feelings of envy. And it's one of the things that I think is so interesting about Shapiro is that he works his way all through the destructive impulses that come with envy, of really wanting to tear it down, to finally coming into a a, a moment of recognition of the ways in which the differences are destructive.
Hmm, hmm,
So, although I don't end up where he ends up, where I think he just imagines a dissolution of religious difference, it is a deep recognizing with coming fueled out of that place of envy of really how toxic those feelings can be.
hmm,
And in
hmm,
that way, it certainly is fosters a relationship that is has more integrity.
hmm, hmm. More honesty, would you say? Something
Yeah,
that's
I think so.
avowing. Yeah,
I think so.
interesting. Yeah. So
Rather than pushing it away and saying, "Oh, but that's okay because we have X, Y, and Z."
right, right, right. That's fascinating. It's almost as if there's a kind of a process of self-analysis that, let's say the successful navigator of the border
Right.
zone would have to go through, involving something that begins with envy and then perhaps, kind of lifts it up to a higher level, makes it into something that's generative and a real relationship.
I think so. And I think one of the, exactly as you say, Ken, and I think also one of the differences is with desire. With desire, one can see it as necessarily productively impossible, right? You desire
Yes,
something, but of course you can't have it.
yes.
And that's a pretty commonplace poetic place out of which poetry is born. Envy is a more um, full-fledged, imaginative engagement with, I'm not just content with theoretically wanting it, I desperately want it. I
Mhm,
feel lack.
mhm,
And
mhm.
out of that space of lack, growth can happen.
It's so fascinating. You talk about some of the great literary, precedents for envy, including Saint Augustine's.
Yeah.
Early in the Confessions, he talks about seeing a child,
Hmm.
who has been, and this is so crucial, who has been already nursed, looking back at another child who is at the breast and having some kind of hate in its eye, some kind of real envy, right? Despite the fact that they
Right.
have already been fed. And that seems to be another of the interesting complexities of envy as opposed to desire. Envy doesn't necessarily, really come out of a personal lack. It may require being thought in those terms, but it also seems to have something gratuitous about it that goes beyond that.
Right. And it's wonderful that you bring up that moment in Augustine, because of course Melanie Klein kind of goes on there in her amplification of envy as something that's very primal, right?
Yeah,
And that's
yeah,
the other thing. It's not a very sophisticated, it is, and that's another thing that I think is one of the things that's so interesting that comes out of some of the poetry, is that you get a real um, visceral, you get cursing and sounds that are ugly. This is that where so you can experience what envy looks like.
right. Very interesting. Um, could we talk a little bit about religion, how it works for the poets you're discussing? It seems, that most of the poets are not observant. Some of them seem to barely
Mm.
acknowledge their own Jewishness as a religious affiliation, see it as a kind of a cultural Judaism. Do you see much difference between the ways in which the poets who are quite religious uh, sort of deal with the border zone as opposed to those who are not at all, interested in their own religiosity or the facts of religion? Does the practice of religion give a stronger anchor for the Jewish Christian encounter, or is it actually an impediment? Sort of the
It's
theological and practical aspects of religion.
it's a terrific question. I'm going to be thinking on my feet a little bit. The only poet in the constellation that I bring together, I would say, is a religious poet, is Denise Levertov. And the religion, of course, that she practices is Catholicism, not Judaism. And I think that for her, the poems, I developed a great more than affection. I really began to care very much for the poems, especially the poems that she wrote late in her life, which are not necessarily the ones she's best known for.
Mm.
And those poems are deeply fed by a religious longing. They're not spiritual, I mean, they're not cultural
Yeah.
experiments, but she wants to come into a relationship with God
While we're
after
talking
many years of fighting that.
Sorry to interrupt you, but on this topic, can you say more about Levertov's own personal sort of involvement in the border zone? Fascinating topic.
Sure. Yeah. She's again, you write a book and you just discover things in ways that you never ever anticipated. Denise Levertov. So the thing I have to say about her is you spell her name Levertov. Her father spelled his last name Levertoff. It's important because her father, Paul Levertov, was the founder of Hebrew Christianity, which was the precursor to Messianic Judaism. And he was born, he was a very talented scholar, a yeshiva scholar, and at least as his daughter tells it, was on his way to school, to yeshiva one day, and found a little scrap of paper, probably written in Yiddish, and read it and said, "The Messiah has arrived," and fell in love with Christianity. And so what did he find? He found the Gospel of Matthew. There were lots and lots of translations, Yiddish translations going around of the New Testament, and he happened to find a bit of paper. And he was thoroughly convinced that this was the path, and that for Jews to fulfill their Judaism, they needed to be Christian and Jewish, both and. And he was passionate about these things. He translated Augustine into Yiddish and into Hebrew and brought it to his congregants. He wrote a mass, a Eucharist ceremony in Yiddish that was to be performed at the third meal every Saturday on Shabbat. And he really crafted this hybrid work. It was awful to grow up in that world. I mean, it was a great experiment for him, but don't try this at home. It was a burden.
So what was Denise's relationship to it?
She didn't write a lot about it. Her sister did, who was very tortured by the relationship, and especially living through World War II and not understanding why Christians were participating in the destructions of Jews. It was an enormous grief and sense of betrayal. Denise moved to the United States. She changed her name and she became a political activist. She was married to a Jewish man, Mitch Goodman, but did not identify particularly as a Jew. And only really once her father died and her sister died, and sort of all the family members were no longer there to question and engage her in ongoing dialogue around this, did she become a serious student of Catholicism. But I think what drew her to Catholicism and why she could recognize it was because of the fierce of the Eucharist, because of the idea of the embodied God. And that was an idea that she had grown up with from her father, who saw the Shekhinah, the feminine emanation, the Kabbalistic emanation of God, as a incarnational figure of God. So she knew the idea of the embodiment of God from Jewish thought. And then when she came to Catholicism, she saw it fully realized. So in that way, she traveled through the border zone.
Fascinating, truly fascinating.
Crazy stuff.
If you don't mind, shall we move backwards a little bit to
Sure.
your wonderful chapter on Mina Loy and Gertrude Stein? You make a very interesting suggestion in that chapter, which is one of my favorites, about Stein's book, Prayers and Portraits. You suggest that the various verbal portraits that she sketches are themselves prayers, and even more than just any old prayer, they're exorcisms, that it's a way for her to expel the people she writes about, including Picasso and Saint Teresa, from her mind or soul or whatever. And I wonder if is that part of what the investigation of the border zone is doing for these poets? And more generally, besides Gertrude Stein, is it relieving them of the burden of the Christian cultural dominance?
That's an interesting, for some of them, I think it is. I think for Stein, I mean, I have to confess, she was the hardest person to write about.
Mm.
I came at it over, backwards, sideways, upside down, all over. And I still am not finished with her. I'm not finished at all. For her, I think she was truly beyond these categories of religion. I love the way she was a religious tourist in the best sense. She cared. I mean, I'm amazed. Actually, and one of the things that amazes me is how few people really talk about Stein and Christianity.
Mm.
Any image of her and Alice sitting together in a salon or any kind of domestic space, you see the rooms are filled with crucifixes and images and all kinds of Christian talismans. I think again she loved this idea of the embodiment, but she also loved the idea that language could be transformative.
Mm.
And as she says, she worships at the altar of language. And because language can alter, ALTER.
Yes.
And so it speaks to her. I think for her, she just simply recognizes something that's usable.
Mm. Interesting. And now that notion of, language is making something happen, which in a sense goes back to the Gospel of John that you referred to
Yes.
originally, and the notion of logos. Does that, in a sense, give Christianity a sort of a better hand in this game, or does you sense that Judaism also offers something, transformative in language that they can draw on?
It's a beautiful question. I think where I have lived for a long time in my work with Jewish American poetry, the starting place that Christianity gives you a leg up when it comes to poetry. And I think that certainly that is something with which Shapiro struggles. I would say that I think it's something that Zukowski struggles
Mm.
with. And for a long time, I thought, up until quite recently, I thought that well may be the case, and Jewish poets have to find something else, but it isn't going to be through that portal of linguistic innovation. Beginning to change my mind. And what's done it, in some ways, it's the end of the book and the recognition of Denise Levertov and her fascination with the embodiment, and then specifically how in Judaism that embodiment comes through the Kabbalah. Because one of the things that I'm beginning to get curious about are poets like Peter Cole, for example, who work marvelously with Hebrew letters. And the idea that the letters themselves in Kabbalah are the sites of creation, that the world was made through the letters. The language is a transformation of creation. So as I go through, I think there is a response, but I'm on the edge of it.
That's a fascinating set of issues you've brought up. Does this imply that you're going to be writing a sequel to this book, or what's your?
It's a sequel. I'm very interested in translation. I know that's going to be a conversation you and I will have at another point. I know
Yes.
you're involved deeply in translation. But one of the things that I have become interested in is how poems are born out of translation. And some of the things that happened here, I mean, of course, there was a huge amount of mistranslation with the Hebrew Bible. And I learned a lot about, the ways in which translation can betray meaning as much as reveal meaning.
Mhm.
So those ideas are beginning to percolate as I go forward.
Fascinating.
And what do you do when you get a poet like Peter Cole, who writes passionately in English, but there's always a specter of another language
Mm.
behind his work?
Mm. I wonder if this is a good time for you to actually read a poem for us.
Sure. So the poem is by Denise Levertov, and it speaks precisely and comes out of that moment that I was talking about just a little bit earlier about Levertov coming to Catholicism, but coming to Catholicism out of the rich background of Kabbalistic and Hasidic thought. And this is this is a very late poem. It's called Standoff. Assail God's hearing with assail God's hearing with gull screech knife blades. Cousin the saints to plead our cause, claiming grace abounding. God crucified on the resolve not to displume our unused wings. Here's nailed palms cannot beat off the flames of incessant sound, strident or plaintive, nor nor reach to annul freedom. Nor would God renege. Our shoulders ache. The abyss gapes at us. When shall we dare to fly?
Wow, that's an amazing poem. Can you
It
tell
really
us,
is.
can you tell us what you think is really going on in this poem?
So the piece that she brings me to is that this notion of the abyss is the one that first captured my attention when I was reading through her poems.
Mm.
Because one of my teachers, I will say, in this book was Martin Buber.
Mm.
Martin Buber has a was very important to Denise Levertov, as well as to her father. And he offers a beautiful phrase that is a counterweight to holy envy. The phrase is holy insecurity.
Mm.
And it comes from a book, a small book he wrote early in his life, his career, called Daniel. And he writes, you must transcend ever anew into the transforming abyss, ever anew vowed to the holy insecurity.
Mm.
So when I found this poem and I saw that this speaker who'd been struggling through so much, trying to come into a relationship with a God, with a divine, asks for the strength, the courage to fly into the abyss. And what I see her doing in this poem is asking for the capacity to enter into a space of not knowing, of uncertainty. So that rather than trying to see the Jewish Christian world in which she was raised as a stable entity, she embraces it as profoundly unstable. And that it's in that instability that meaning will be discovered.
That's really beautiful. That's really amazing. I know that you go on to talk about how this works for Leonard Cohen, who is probably the most well-known of the figures that you discuss in this
Yes,
book.
it's true.
So can you say a little bit about how this works for Leonard Cohen, who is such a complex thinker
Oh,
about religion?
and another gift out to Martin Buber and Leonard Cohen. They are teachers for a lifetime. They really are.
I would call them Jewish saints myself.
Yeah, they are. You just sit absorbed. So Leonard Cohen was a late find for me in this book. And what happened was I stumbled across, and many people in the watching this may know of it. There have been a million, I don't know how many, but many covers of Hallelujah. Lots and lots. And there's a wonderful documentary now, some of you may have seen it, Hallelujah, that tracks the genesis and the celebration and the embrace of this amazing, amazing prayer song. And one of them was a Yiddish cover by a neo-klezmer singer named Daniel Kahn. And he translated it into Yiddish and performs it in a very self-consciously Fiddler on the Roof kind of way. And I found it terribly irritating. And other people I knew loved it, just thought it was fabulous. And so I had to think about what bugs me about this. And I realized in the course of it that I think what Kahn does is completely contrary to what Leonard Cohen gives us with Hallelujah. Is he gives us this Cohen gives us this amazingly capacious hymn. There are many, many versions and different stanzas. I think there's over 50 stanzas, and some of them have the Holy Dove, and some of them have King David. And it really is this interreligious celebration, and it gets sung in churches, and it gets sung in congregations, and it's claimed by Buddhists. And what Kahn wanted to do was he wanted to lock it down. You know, he wanted to say, oh no, this is really Jewish, which seemed exactly contrary to the impulse and the prophecy, I think, of Leonard Cohen, which is to embrace holy insecurity.
That is really terrific. So interesting. And of course, Hallelujah is one of the only, let's say Hebrew expressions or, compound words that all Christians
Absolutely.
know, that would never be doubted as, somehow, authentically part of the Christian world. But in fact, it is, a specific Jewish, praise of God. And it's wonderful how there is this possibility of universalism that seems to rise up without, if you will, dissolving the individual differences. That seems
and that's the important part,
point.
Exactly what you said, Ken.
Yeah.
It is the specific.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a site of contiguities, not dissolution.
Yeah. And that seems to be a very powerful sort of, if you will, lesson that we get from these poets of the border zone, that there's got to be a way to both rise above the individual without dissolving the individual, the specific, the particular in both of these religions. Or if you want to include, Buddhism, in it too, as Leonard Cohen does, something which seems to almost go beyond religion itself, right? Something that can be part of Judaism or part of Christianity without in any way imposing a foreign belief system. It seems to me that Buddhism is almost a kind of a wonderful, Leonard Cohen sort of metaphor for the possibility of authentic universalism that doesn't dissolve individual differences.
Right. But I like very much the way you speak of it as a metaphor. Because of course, I mean, he was just, he spent many years, long, really hard work as a Buddhist. And yet at a certain point, felt obliged, compelled to come back to Judaism, or at least to reside more fully in the space of Judaism, without leaving off
Mm,
all of the deep teachings of Buddhism.
mm. That is a fascinating example. It certainly is to me of the border zone being explored in really profound ways. And what about for you personally? You're a poet as well as a scholar of poetry.
I'm
No?
a wannabe.
Oh, okay. Well,
No, I as close as I come as to writing poetry is translation. That's as close as I come.
well, let's put it this way then. Personally, for you, do you have anything in particular in Christianity or Christian poetry for that matter that you find enviable, that you think is that supplements a lack, if you will, in Judaism or Jewish poetry, or presents something that is in addition to Judaism but really valuable? What personally, let's say, resonates for you in the quest of these poets grappling in the border zone?
Oh, so much resonates for me. I think you and I spoke at one point in earlier in a conversation that well, the notion of an embodied God is a a person, a presence who gets what it is to be a human being, understands the loving as a human being, being in pain as a human being, that deep empathy, intimacy that I think Christians come by much more easily and much more honestly.
Hmm, hmm.
It would not be I'll be many people many Jews who say um, many of us Jews struggle with prayer. We're not we're certainly spontaneous prayer, right? Really just being able to access as an individual a intimate, fully realized relationship with a divine. That doesn't come easy,
Hmm.
right? We're really great at studying. I love studying and talking about what we're studying and making beautiful arabesques of
Hmm.
thought. But that idea that one can simply on one's own address, that is a hard won relationship.
That's very interesting. And I wonder if on some level it's partly because in Judaism there's a sense of that was once perhaps the case, a kind of intimacy with God, that you think about the actual development of even the five books of Moses, and there's
Right.
increasing distance from God, that at first
Yes.
God is very, very close
Yes.
and he walks, side by side
Right.
with those he loves. But increasingly God seems to fade, and maybe that's that yearning for something that Judaism once had is something that Christianity and that notion of the incarnational and the
Right.
human God that you're talking about, maybe that's what's so attractive about that, right?
I think that that's right. And you bring to mind one of the beautiful and yet very difficult notion that we have in Judaism, which is that of Hester Panim, that God has hidden its face,
Yes.
right? And the notion that there is this distance, a perpetual distance. Um, and one of the reasons I'm drawn to neo-Hasidic figures, thinkers like Martin Buber, and then of course his teachers, the Baal Shem Tov and Nachman of Breslov, is because I think they had the belief in the possibility of an unextraordinary, ongoing, ordinary relationship.
Mm.
But that's gotten muted in traditional Jewish teachings, right? And so that we have to fight our way through the thicket of texts and of feelings of abandonment, I want to say, of feeling abandoned as Jews. And that has caused a grief. It's an unspoken grief in many places. But that's something certainly that I feel.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. And my sense is that this investigation of the border zone is truly therapeutic for people who experience that sense of a lost relationship, that possibly the terms of relationship can be restored by experiencing, this other religion's ability to, transhume that lack and go beyond the distance and find a new proximity. So there really is something, it seems to me, psychoanalytic, therapeutic about this process that you're describing. And I think this is what makes it so not only poetically, but humanly so enriching and transformative.
I'm glad that you see that about it. That is really beautiful. The artist who loaned her image for this, Beth Krensky, she's someone who deeply understands the therapeutic, the healing nature. Much of her work is around ritual, performance ritual that brings together traditions and understands that in that border zone, not negating the difference between the two, but bringing to be contiguous, that there is healing to be found.
Well, I want to thank you for introducing me to her work, and not only her work, but really deepening my knowledge and my appreciation of all of the poets that you discuss. This is such a wonderful book. It's rich conceptually, but it's fabulous as an account of what's going on in these utterly fascinating poets, many of whom are not as well read as they should be, perhaps all of whom are not as well read as they should be.
Shout out for reading poetry.
Yeah,
I love
absolutely.
it. Good.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your work with us today. And I look forward to seeing, what you continue to write in this wonderfully interesting work.
Oh, well, Ken, I couldn't hope for a better interlocutor. Thank you for your generosity and really caring about the issues and the poets. It means a
Yeah,
lot to
thank
me.
you. And thanks to the Center for Jewish Studies.
Thank you. Yes.